Okay, so a couple of notes about this presentation. A lot of the code examples I'm going to give you formatted it to be easily read on the screen, not necessarily because that's how I particularly write this stuff. So left off a lot of semicolons just because you get rid of a little bit of clutter. And I'm also not using any prefixes in this. So. All right. So, and yeah, I got a little bit lazy. If you're going to look at these slides online, I'll give you the link. Check them out in Chrome because I have not looked at it in anything else. It's a slide. All right, so some non-animation CSS that we need to be comfortable with. All right, so when you start delving into CSS animation, you want to be super comfortable with absolute positioning and relative positioning, especially the relationship between the two. So, I mean, everybody here writes CSS. We all know that whenever we have a container that's position relative and you absolutely position items inside of it, we're going to calculate their position based off that parent. Super important to know here. So, going to be doing a lot of transforms. I'll be honest, I think transforms are where most of the really cool animation comes from. So this is how we can move things around, scale them, skew and rotate them. Opacity, obviously. Fade things in and out. Now, I'm not going to go into every single property CSS that can or cannot be animated. We don't have time for that. There's documentation out there for it. And a lot of stuff we don't want to animate anyway. But as a rule of thumb, just about anything that has a number or a color property can be animated. Not saying they should be animated, but they can be. So gradients are the big exception. Currently, we can't actually animate gradients themselves. That would be really cool. But I understand why. But there's some ways to get around that, especially if we want to just kind of move them around. Now, things that have keywords, like display block to display none, that's not going to animate. And some other things, you know, like left 0 to right 0. If you just want to move something from left 0 to right 0, that's not going to work because those are actually two different CSS properties, right? Some browsers will try to take a stab at it. It's not going to work well, but there's ways around that as well. All right, so let's talk about what an animation actually is. And really what we're talking about is adding a time element to a change in CSS. So we have these changes in our CSS. By adding time to it, we get the animation that takes place. Third thing we need is something to cause the animation. So when we're talking about things like transitions, you know, hover effects, you know, whenever we mouse over a navigation link, that's something that can trigger an animation. We can use JavaScript to trigger it. The page load itself can trigger it. But in this particular case, my friend Marley here, I've got a little bit of jQuery sitting on him. So whenever I click him, he gets smaller. He scales out, scales back in. So with CSS animation, there's two main brands of it, two different parts of it. The first is called transitions, and the second is keyframe animations. We're going to start with transitions because I think this is the big time bang for the buck that you can start integrating right now. At its basic core, all we're doing is adding that time element between a change in CSS. So in this particular example here, I've got these two links over here. One has a transition on it. That's 1 second. The other doesn't have any transition. So whenever we hover over this, this anchor tag, you can see over here, the background color is going to change. The color of the text is going to change. So by default, what we're used to, we hover over this, and it goes instantly to that next color. But just by adding the transition to it, we can define the amount of time that it takes for those properties to change. And all it is that's just one line of CSS that we can do that with. So by default, when you add this transition 1 second to it, every single change that happens in that hover effect or whenever you're adding that class, all the CSS that's supposed to change is going to transition if it can. So in the case of Marley right now, let's see, I've changed this up a little bit and I've got a transform on them. on this hover effect. He's going to scale to 1.5, and he's going to rotate 180 degrees. And it's going to take 1 second for that to happen. So it scales up, move it, goes back to its original position, scale up, and rotates. So here's a quick question. How many of you are actually using transforms in any way, shape, or form right now? Okay. Outside of animations? We don't really use them a lot. But when it comes to animation, they're just absolutely immensely powerful. So we're going to derail things a little bit. Now that we've kind of talked about the very basics of transitions, I want to talk to you about these transitions. And especially, I mean, these transforms. God, I really hope that it wasn't the same person who decided to name these transitions, transforms, and the translate of transforms, because I don't know how many times I've been talking about these things and just started substituting one for the other. But the transition is the animation. It's the time that we say it's going to take for these changes to take place. The transform is a CSS property that allows us to do a lot of different things. Translate is a piece of transform. So I'm not going to read this wall of text. There's no sense in it. But I really feel like the transforms are where the really cool things in animation can take place. It's where we can get 3D. It's where we get the super high performance, buttery moves. The cool thing about transforms is that when these things take place, the browser doesn't have to recalculate the entire page. All it does is recalculate that little bit that is moving around. If you translate something, if you move something around, make it grow or spin, you're not affecting other DOM elements. So you don't have to worry if you've got this array of images and you make one of them get bigger whenever you hover over it. You don't have to worry about the floats breaking on all these things. So a lot of power in these things. So let's talk about it for a little while. Let's start with translate. So it says it's a part of transform, and it's simply moving an object around in 2D space. There is a 3D form of it. We're not going to go into 3D tonight just simply because we don't have 6 hours. So think of it as very similar to relative positioning. Relative positioning, we're moving things up, down, left, right. And this is exactly the same as that. So we can give it, in parentheses, we can do a comma separation, and first is x-axis, second is the y-axis. So left, right, up, down, positive, negative. So in this case right here, I've added a little target hover. So it's just going to move over to the, move down 100 pixels and right 100 pixels. Super easy, and like I said, the animation is very smooth. Now, the cool thing about one of the cool things about translate is that this can stack on top of regular positioning. So let's say you've got something absolutely positioned, in your interface. Well, you can translate it, move it over here, move it over here. You can move it off stage. You can do all these things to it without having to worry about what its original position was. Yeah, so it kind of gives you a second layer of being able to move this thing around. The scaling. Well, what's scaling? Yes.
When you translate that element, and then technically, like if you ask the browser where is that element, is it going to tell you the original place, or is it going to tell you the translated location? Because it looked like when you hovered over it, right, and then
it
was relative to its original.
Until I actually moved the mouse, it was still registering it as being right there. Now, technically, the browser still calculates everything else as though the object was still in its original place. So, like I said, if you move it off stage, let's say you had something sitting beside it, and both of those things were floating next to each other. I mean, that other one isn't going to pop over because all of a sudden things over there. If you were using absolute positioning, it absolutely would. But yeah, it depends on how you're going about making that calculation. I don't want to give you a wrong answer on that. So. Anyway, so in this particular case, with scale, we can scale, if we give it one number, it's going to scale both dimensions by that one number. So by default, scale is 1. Any object that's out there, it is currently being scaled at 1. If we scale it to 2, it's going to get twice as big. But we can comma separate it, and we can scale it on the x and y axes separately. So like in the case of this, it's going to get a lot wider, and then they're on top. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but did you see how it's not that obvious on here, how the text gets a little grainy there? Any guess as to why that's happening?
Because you're whitening it more than you're doing a 2,3. You're not doing a 3,3.
Well, that's part of the image. Is that text on the image, or is it actual?
This is actual text. It's actually whenever the animation gets done, all of a sudden the text becomes very clear again.
Because you're not recycling text,
Oh, sort of. So what's happening is the browser is actually turning this element into a bitmap. And just like an image, when you stretch out an image that has text on it, we start to see those artifacts from it. And that's what the browser's doing. Whenever the animation is finished, then it goes in, and, at least Chrome does, it kind of goes in and recalculates how that text should look. It gives it its aliasing and all that kind of stuff. But while that animation is in place, it can get a little bit fugly because of that. So just be aware of that. So let's talk about, yes?
When Chrome goes back and re-renders it, does it re-render the text and allow it to, does it render it back to its normal size, or does it keep it stretched?
It kept it, yeah, so it actually, it made the text much clearer, but it's calculating it in this skewed form. All right, so rotations. Pretty simple stuff. This again falls under our transform. You can rotate it whatever amount of degrees we want to. In this case right here, I'm simply moving it 180 degrees so that the box is now upside down. By the way, if you ever try to rotate a circle, it's not going to be very obvious that you did that. Unless you start playing with the transform origin. All right, so transform origin. Have you guys noticed that all of these little transforms that we've done have happened from the center of the object? By default, the transform origin of anything that you manipulate is going to be the dead center of it, which is, by percentage, is 50-50. So we can move the transform origin around. So if we want to put it on the top left, we can use those keywords. We can use percentages, based off of that, if you just think about that 50-50 being kind of that middle space, and we can move the transform origin off of the actual object so we have something that swings on a pendulum. We can use percentage, we can use pixel values. There's a lot of different options there. But what I want to show you is that we got the same rotation that we had earlier. But on this first one, what I've done is I've moved the transform origin to the top left. So the animation takes its place targeted on that. So everything kind of swings around that. The reason I have two of these on here is that I want to show you that transform origin is also an animatable property. So if you notice this target 1, transform origin top left. Target 2, hover, has the transform origin change. I didn't change its original origin. It's still center, right? So whenever I do that same, I have that same animation on there, same transition, the origin is actually moving around as it moves. So I just pointed this out because it can cause very strange reactions, unexpected things. And two, you can get some interesting effects out of this. Once I was building a little solar system and I wanted it to be elliptical, so I had to play around with the transform origin over time. But it can cause some interesting, almost random effects. I kind of like that. Yeah, so that, we move all around.
Question.
Yes?
Is there easing going on, or is that?
Yes, so, yeah, by default, by default, all transitions have what's called the ease timing function on it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. All right, so because transform is a single property, if we want to rotate it, move it, and scale it, we have to make all those in the same property, which is simply a matter of putting them in there. Now I've put them on separate lines just to make it a little bit easier. You don't have to be comma separated. You just go ahead and put a translate and a rotate and a scale all in there, and all those things happen. So, I mean, you can do a lot of fun things with this. Yes?
I noticed you said earlier that students seem to be doing everything clockwise. Do you use a negative number to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you want to go counterclockwise, negative number, and it can be. I don't think that there's an absolute limit on it, but I don't know that for an absolute certainty. I have to look that up. But yeah, so negative, and the same thing with translate. If I want to move it to the left, I use a negative number. Want to move it up, negative number. All right, so I feel like we have a better grasp on these transforms that I'm going to be throwing in here a little bit. All right, so let's move back over to transitions. So we got Marley back up here, and again, and make a little bit more sense now. Whenever we hover over him, he's going to scale. I'm going to get 1.5 bigger, and he's going to rotate 180 degrees, and it's going to take a second for that to happen. As long as this active state is being applied, he's going to stay there. When I move my mouse off, it snaps back to its original position. Now, why did it snap back? I think on these other ones, a little ahead of myself, they ease back into their position. And it's really just because I've got the transition on the hover state and not on the default state. We'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. I wasn't sure if anybody had caught that yet. All right, but like I said, any change that we have in the CSS that can be animated will. If it can be transitioned, it will, just by simply putting this transition of 1 second on it. But what if that's not what we want? What if we want one property to animate but not another? What if we want one to take 2 seconds and one to take 3 seconds? Well, we have that kind of control. So when we're declaring our transition, instead of just saying 1 second, everything, we can define what property is going to transition. So in the case of this, I said, all right, in the transition, I want the transform to take 1 second. And then by using comma separation, I can say, all right, well, since we're going to be animating this opacity too, let's go ahead and let that take 3 seconds. So when we do the hover action, the first two things, the transform and the twist, will take 1 second, and it will take 3 seconds for it to fade out. Well, that's not enough to muck with. We can also put delays on things, and these delays can either be across the board or they can be per item. So in this case right here, we have this animation delay, and I've got two values there, a 0 and a comma and 2 seconds. Well, those are conforming to the transition declaration. So the transform that said was going to take 1 second, have a 0 delay on it. The opacity transition is going to take 2 seconds. So when I hover over Marley, it takes him that 1 second to flip over. There's a little bit of a delay, and then slowly fades out over 3 seconds. So the first property goes immediately because there's no delay on it. The second one is delayed 2 seconds. So we can get a fair amount of fine-tuned control over what we want. Yes?
It's delayed absolutely as opposed to relative. So the opacity changed only after the rotation, but it's based on the timer on the beginning.
The opacity waited 2 seconds according to this to actually start. Since the first animation was only a second, it was already done for a whole second for that to take place. I guess it's a little bit of an odd example, but I wanted it to be really obvious that the second one had a much longer delay. But yeah, I mean, so if we want to move something and fade it out afterwards, I mean, we have that kind of control. So let's kind of talk about these timing functions. And you're asking about what the, if there was any kind of easing going on. Well, out of the box, we have a number of ways to bring in easing. And it's called the transition timing function. By default, what we have is called linear. I mean, is ease. And basically what ease is it starts off pretty fast and then eases out. So this has a hard acceleration and then slows down towards the end. Linear is going to be smooth all the way across. Like the starry background that I have on there is on a linear animation. Ease in is going to start slow and accelerate, and then it kind of hits that brick wall, right? It hits its top speed, and whenever the transition ends, it's like a car, accelerating and then hitting a wall. Ease out is the opposite of that. It's a car at full speed and then eventually braking to a stop. Ease in out combines those two. Now, it's possible to create your own timing functions, and you know what? There's good tools for that. Let me show you one. So this is a little web app called Caesar. And if you just look up Caesar, CSS, you'll find a link. I'll put this link at the end of the slides as well. Actually, this may need to get refreshed. There we are. So it gives us this Bezier curve that we can play with. And what it's showing us right now is the linear equation, and so we can kind of test it by moving this object left and right or changing its width. Now, if we want to play with it, say, all right, well, let's start off a little bit slower than something like that. You kind of see how it accelerates into it. This is a good way to kind of see what all these things look like. So ease, has a quick acceleration and then tapers out. Ease in, out, very smooth on both ends. Let's say you can play with it yourself, and you can even drag this thing into negative values, which is going to give it a little bit of a bounce. Now, warning on this one right here, according to the spec, the negative values aren't actually allowed. The fact that Chrome lets us do this is kind of cool, but at least the way the spec was written previously, I don't have to check to see if that's changed. But these negative values weren't actually in it, so you may not get the same effect in every browser if you decide to go something like this. But anyway, it's a fun little tool for building your own custom animations. All right, so and then back to what I was talking about earlier. Sometimes whenever I'm hovering on these things and I take my mouse off, it snaps back into its original positions. Other times it eases back into its original position. And that really just has to do with one thing. It's where I put that transition on. So if I put the transition on the hover state, well, when is the transition taking place? When I'm hovering on it. If I'm not hovering on it, there's no transition, therefore it should snap back into place. But if you put the transition on the original object, let's say you want to navigate, you want to animate your navigation, right? If you want this fade in and fade out, or these changes to happen whenever you mouse on or mouse off, you want to have the transition on the anchor tag itself, not on the hover. So in this case right here, it spins around and it spins back into place whenever I take the mouse off. All right, so summing up transitions a little bit. Essentially, we're just going between declared styles to two different states, be it the default in the hover, or if there's some kind of class that's in things. And we're adding a time factor to that. We can delay them. We can stagger them with these delays. We can give things different speeds, different amounts of time. We need to have some sort of trigger for this to happen. So There has to be a hover state. There has to, you need to have your hover. That's the one thing you can do without any kind of JavaScript. Or you can, use JavaScript to add a class to something. You can add a class directly to the object. You can add a class to its parent. As long as you're using your CSS specificity rules, you can make a lot of things happen. We'll talk more about that in a little while. All right. Yeah, so that one more thing. Oh, by the way, I hate this picture. I don't know, trying to find a picture of the guy, and all you come up with on Google search is this. So I like this one. Anyway, so yeah, that DisplayNone thing. We can't, I know it's really useful when you're building an interface, you want to hide something, and then you want to animate it coming on. Well, DisplayNone is going to be a pain in your butt. And that's just simply because when you're talking about this transition, right? If it's DisplayNone, none of those styles are getting calculated. So when you take that off with the same action, like adding a class or something like that to it to show it, its original values don't get calculated. So the transition, well, there's nothing to transition to. You're in the end state. We'll talk more about that in a little. All right. So, yes?
So can we do what you showed earlier with the opaque, make it not opaque, and then do a DisplayNone afterwards?
I'm sorry, what?
You make the, earlier you had things appear on the screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you could add DisplayNone afterwards, and that way we could go on forever.
Yes. Yeah, we could absolutely do something like that. There's, time permitting, but there was a slide I wanted to put in here about TransitionIn. There's some JavaScript stuff that you can put on there, put these listeners on, so you can detect when an animation is finished, and then use JavaScript to perform some kind of function like removing it completely from the DOM, or adding a third class to it. One of the, like jQuery Mobile uses that heavily. Whenever if you guys have played with that much, you've got these page transitions. Well, it has one page, it creates this other page off stage, moves things over, and then, whenever it detects that the animation is ended, it's doing some other manipulation, adding some classes adding or removing classes to both of those objects. So, yes, there's absolutely ways of doing that. There's all kinds of fun things you can do. All right, so let's move away from transitions and talk about some keyframe animations. So keyframe animations consist of two parts: the keyframe list and the actual animation declaration. So here's a quick example of a keyframe list. So this is the first set of code over here is what's called a keyframe list. So it's the ampersand keyframes, and then a name. You've got to have a name for this thing because you're going to reference it later. So in this particular case, I recommend giving it a name that's recognizable, that describes what the animation is doing. Just because, honestly, you can reuse these things, and you want to know what it is you're trying to dig at. So I've named this the kitty drum, and at 0, it's at its default state. It's scale 1, rotate 0. At 50%, he's getting a little bit bigger and rotating to the right 30 degrees. And then at the finish mark, he's going to go to scale 0 and rotate negative 180 degrees. So he's going to go counterclockwise for a while. So I'm describing what's going to happen at each stage of the animation. Now, that's not enough to use it. Whenever whatever it is that you do, in your class or your active state, you need to bring reference that animation for it to happen. And we do that with this animation declaration. So I have to bring in the animation and then tell it what keyframe list to use and how much time to do that. So in the case of the kitty, I put a easy little jQuery thing, and it's going to add a class called active to it. And it runs through that keyframe list in the amount of time that I specified. Drops down to nothing. And when it finishes, it goes back to its original state. That's by default what a keyframe animation is going to do. Now, there's a lot of stuff we can do with keyframe animations. Just like with transitions, we can delay When, how long, we can put a delay on it, so whatever it is that happens, you get a little bit of delay, and then the animation takes place. We can define those timing functions, so we can make it linear, or we can do the ease in and out, we can do all that stuff. Iteration count's kind of fun. We can tell the keyframe animation to happen twice, or 12 times, or repeat infinitely. With animation direction, we can choose whether or not it runs forwards or backwards. Or if it's repeating, it goes to the end and then alternates going back down. And so on and so forth. In film mode is what happens when the animation is done. So like I said, by default, the object's going to go with whatever its default styling was. But with film mode, we can say, all right, whenever you end, I want you to use that last part of the keyframe animation and stay there. So in this particular case right here, I've got the keyframe list. We're starting at 0 degrees, and at 0 degrees at 0%, and at 100%, we're at 360 degrees. So if you want to create a loop, what you have to do is focus on making sure that that last number in the sequence is the same as the beginning. Well, 360 is the same as 0, right? So we get that infinite loop going on. Well, what makes it infinite is the fact that, on the iteration count, I'm actually using the shorthand right here. It's told to go infinitely. And to make it smooth, I've told it to use the linear timing function, which is why whenever it gets around back to the beginning, it doesn't slow down. It just keeps on spinning, round and round, making me dizzy.
So is that the preferred way to do it? If you want to spin 5 times?
I'm sorry? Yeah, if you want it to happen 5 times.
The iterator?
Yes.
You wouldn't times 360 times 5.
You could go either way. I kind of prefer the iteration count, because what it allows me to do is I can reuse this keyframe list, and I can have, it's like, say I have one thing and I want that to go 5 times, and I got another that's only going to have to rotate once. I can still reference that same keyframe list and just give it that iteration count and additional time. Reuse some code. Yes?
Can you escape out of it?
Can I what?
Escape out of it.
Yes, you absolutely can. There's. Are we starting to get into a little bit of seizure time right now?
No, I just want to make sure you're good.
I thought about naming this animation Kitty Twerk, but I like Marley. I wouldn't do that to him. But no, there's some JavaScript stuff that you can do to actually stop the animation. You can remove the state from it.
So it's not CSS, it's JavaScript or jQuery.
Well, because what you're going to want, pure CSS, no, because you got to have some sort of change to get rid of that. But we can, yes.
Yeah. So it's right now it's just iterating for all 10 of those cycles. Is there a way you can jump in sequence, or do you have to use jQuery just to go back?
Right. Well, you can jump into. I don't think quite what you're getting to. We can start and stop the.
You have it in a linear pattern here.
Right.
Your animation clutch. Is there a way to just set it where it can be more randomized, or do you have to use jQuery to have it jump?
Yeah. There's not in this particular instance right now. Yeah. There's no randomness that can come out of this. Although if you were a SAS or less guy, I bet there's some fun math that you could have going on in there in order to create these random things.
So you can't, like, if you put 9 items up there and it says step 2, it would give you some randomization.
Not like this, but you could go about it in other ways. Like in that particular example, what I'd probably do is create multiple animations and sequence them out.
So all these animations that you've showed us so far are strictly CSS3. There's no JavaScript or jQuery, or did I misunderstand?
The only JavaScript that I've used so far has been to, like in the case of, where was he? Like this guy right here.
Okay.
I've got a real simple script that simply When I click on something that has a class clickable, it adds the active class to it, or toggles that class. Yeah, just so not everything's a hover.
Just so that, but when you, with the JavaScript, it's just going to activate what you have right there.
Yeah, it's just to kind of create that, that change in the DOM so that I can use specificity in CSS in order to cause that trigger. Because, my animation happens on Kitty active. On Kitty, he's just sitting there. But whenever he has that active class, that's when the animation takes place in this particular instance. In this, this one over here, the animation happens by default. I think I've got this one right here set up so that it actually starts whenever the this particular slide is active. But just like we can style things, from a class on a parent, we can activate animations in that same way. All right, so we can reuse.
Good thing I didn't have beer.
No, we won't leave this one out as long yet. This is why I'm looking at you. All right? But no, I mean, so this is two objects that are using the same keyframe animation. Just have that keyframe animation that goes 360 degrees around. Well, all right. So on the cat, I've changed the transform origin so that he kind of spins around this central point into infinity. And the bigger one is using the same keyframe animation. It just has more time being applied to it. All right, so that's the gist with keyframe animations. But we can go further. Now, I don't know how many of you, because of the parental guidance thing in the title, I'm thinking I'm going to have some very questionable slides or something. I thought about that. But, play off of it, but yeah, it's probably not a good idea. Anyway, so parental guidance. What's that? So, parental guidance. What I was referring to there is that we can use the specificity rules in CSS in order to trigger these animations. How many WordPress people out there do we have? I don't know what version of WordPress it was, but whenever they started injecting the page classes and things, was it in the body? Whenever they did that, and I saw it, realized that I could use that to, well, now the About page can be styled completely different from the home page and all these things without having to build all these new templates. It started making me think. And we can use those same techniques with CSS animation in order to drive these things. So one of the things when I started building interfaces that were animated is, first you're playing in jQuery, it's like, okay, well I need this and this and this and this. All right, well I got to add classes to all these things. No, we can use a single class higher up in the DOM, class or ID, higher up in the DOM and control many things. So we've got a quick little app right here. So this gray container right here, it's got the class interface, position relative, just so I can absolutely position some things inside of it. It's got a background color. We've got these three buttons up top, view home, view day, view night, and what those are going to do is with a tiny little bit of jQuery, they're going to add these IDs to that container. And from there, we're going to animate a very small interface. So let's start with just changing the color, the background color of this thing. View day, whenever it gets that ID, I want it to change to a deep sky blue, which looks green. All right, so it's early spring in Atlanta. Everybody knows what that is. All right, so view night. All right, let me go back to home. So, like it says, it's just jQuery adding the relative ID to that container. So easy peasy, right? And I got this 1 second transition on it, so the background color fades between those things. Everybody good with that? All right, well let's add stuff to it. So got a couple of divs in here with a lot of border radius on it, a little bit of glow. One of them's orange is the sun, one of them's the moon. Now, quick show of hands. How many folks out there are using precompilers right now? All right, the rest of you need to start. It is time. It's time to jump on that because it just really ramps up the amount of power that you have. Anyway, so I spend most of my time in less, so these examples are going to conform to that, but I'll explain the differences. So created these two classes over here. One's called ship, and that's going to, it has a transform, the translate of 0, 0. So it's the default state. Show says, don't move, just go back to your original place. This hide bottom class has this transform where it translates 0, negative 1,000 pixels, which is going to pull it off the stage. Then we can use, with less, instead of having to write, having to type these things down over and over and over, I can just reference those classes. So in view night, I wanted to get everything that hide bottom has. And on moon, the moon, I want to be shown. It's the opposite with the day. So if you want to, so the rendered code was actually going to say is, in this view night, the sun is going to be translated off stage and the moon is going to be its default position. Those don't have anything for view home, which is why we can see both of these guys. So when I move to view day, the sun is showing, the moon is hidden off stage. And the transition, the background, still happens. So now, still one ID, and we're controlling multiple things with it. Easy peasy, right? The reason I like using these mixins, and okay, SAS people, yes, the syntax for the mixins is very different. The reason I like, going the mixin route is I can create one animation, reuse it, and if it gets to a point where I want to tweak that transform, maybe it needs to arc a little bit or something like that. Every place that I'm using it will get that update. All right, so if we can do one thing, we can do two things. In this case, I've added a couple more friends to this. So, I've added a couple additional classes. We've got this hide left and this hide right. We're just going to move things, translating them off the stage, left and right. Again, we've got three things that are going on, all controlled by one ID. So, kind of extrapolate that, into a more complex interface. With these IDs, we can pick and choose, what things need to be showing and when. Now, a lot of times that's better off being done with JavaScript. And if you're working in Angular or something like that, it's got its own stuff going on. We'll get into that just a little bit. Single page apps are really tricky with this stuff. And a lot of that is because single page apps, it likes to create content as you go. It's like all these different widgets that you have typically they don't exist until, whatever system it is that you're building tells them to be there. So you kind of have to work around some of those things. Like going back to that problem with DisplayNone, if content doesn't exist, it's not going to transition all of a sudden whenever it goes from being nothing to being something, and that parent ID is already there. So we have options. We can use keyframe animations. In this particular case, I've got a box that's on the stage, and you can't see it right now because it's DisplayNone. It's also got a scale 0, so if it wasn't DisplayNone, you still wouldn't be able to see it. I've got this transition button over here. I'm just going to put this view transition on there, and it's going to activate styles that are on a transition. So it's going to scale up to 1. It'll get a display block scale, and scale 1, as you can see, there's no transition, because that original state never really existed, right? With a keyframe animation, however, because these styles are encapsulated in the keyframe list, we still get them. So if we create something on the DOM, on the fly, we can still put a keyframe animation on it and get that animation so that it comes in. This stuff gets, the more complex your apps get, the more weird it gets. I just want, this slide right here is just here to show that keyframe list. So it started out as 0, at scale 0, and goes up to 1. I had to put that fill node on there forward so it wouldn't automatically snap down to nothing again. So I'm going to show you guys a quick example of that. And this is an application that I built for a small startup in Austin called Briga. It's a robotic coffee machine that has, so it has a couple of touch screens on it. One of them is this one that allows you to configure a drink and have this robot make it for you. It's built-in backbone. Let me zoom this stuff in just a little bit so you can kind of see what's going on. And as you can see, right now, I've got this ID on there, view menu. So when we're on the menu view, I've got the CSS on there so that each of these little hexagons are going to be in their original place. By default, I have these hidden off stage, at least when they exist. Same thing with any other interfaces that I don't need for this, for view-home. Any widget that exists in the DOM is hidden by default. So whenever I click on one of these things, we remove that ID, which causes these things to transition off the stage. And then we add the ID of the next view for our application, which causes that interface to go to its 0 spaces. So it's still kind of that same concept we were talking about before with the sun and moon, but we've added kind of a delay in between. And that delay allows us to do a couple of things. One, make our API calls. Two, build that, construct all these pieces of interface, construct that onto the DOM, and whenever it does show up, it's nice and hidden off stage.
So was this latte stuff, was this already in the DOM or this was pulled in afterwards?
It was built afterwards. Now I've got, this version of it, I've actually got separate containers for it, so that whenever it does get built, it's not actually getting built in the same view container as the other stuff, like those hexagons. So those hexagons still exist because I don't want to build those every single time. I also wanted the objects to exist at the same time, so that whenever those original items would slide off, interface could be moving on at the same time.
So when you say it's moving on, what happens if you had a slow AJAX request?
Okay, so the other pieces, they would animate off, and that AJAX request is being made, and whenever it finally gets done, the view gets added to the bottom. That's kind of the last thing that happens in that particular controller is whenever the AJAX request is done and the objects are built, then we get the ID so those things can be animated on.
And the ID is hidden in the first keyframe, right?
What's that?
The ID triggers the first keyframe, which is why.
Right.
So
these are all transitions.
Yeah.
And that's, yes.
Your AJAX is going to be on the local box. It's not going to be on the side, right?
I'm sorry?
The AJAX is going to be on the box itself.
I mean, this is actually a remote website we're looking at right now that's talking to an API that's on a different server from that.
No, but in the future, when you deploy, it's going to be the same way.
Right. Yeah, the AJAX is happening in the browser.
Right. So it won't be there shouldn't be a delay unless it's a problem.
Well, part of the reason we had to build in these delays and things like that is because they want to put these things at airports, and airports have notoriously crap, internet connections. So, kind of have some little failbacks in there for that. But yeah, so going back over here, the ID is removed, making its call. It's taking some time.
So yeah, so that's an example of that happening.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
If it would have taken much longer, there would have been an alert that popped up that said, actually, I don't remember what it says anymore, but that was the original thing.
So you just have a delay in backbone, and if it times out, you would just execute.
That sounds right. It's been a while since I built this, but I guess that sounds right.
But I thought you said you still had the hexagons, though.
Yeah, so they're actually sitting like below the stage. The other thing, the asterisk with that was they changed it so they wanted the menu to get rebuilt every time because there was a slight possibility that the robot may run out of certain ingredients, in which case they didn't want people to be able to order that again. So, but yeah, so they are down there, but it's still getting rebuilt.
So did you worry at all about reflow? I mean, keeping those hexagons in, you know, you're talking about not calculating styles anymore, but adding the data to the DOM. Did you worry at all? I mean, have you been concerned about reflow at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're trying to get a nice animation out of it, you absolutely have to worry about that, which is why most of that stuff happens off stage. You know, like all those data attributes and all that kind of stuff that's attached to most of this stuff, you know, happens whenever it gets constructed. And there are exceptions whenever you're, over here and, you want to add some syrup to it or some sugar. We've got things that are changing there in the data attributes, but it's not causing the repaints, at least for these particular animations.
Gotcha. Did you worry at all about frame rates? At all?
I'm
just curious. You seem to care a lot about the animation.
Number one concern. Yeah. So whenever you're doing these translations and you start to, like coming back over here. Okay, so this is like a 4-year-old MacBook Air that this is running on, right? This is not power machine. But still, I think we're bringing a frame rate counter on. We're getting darn close to 60.
Yeah, I figured.
Very smooth. It's even very smooth on the big screen. That being said, when they tried to put a VM on the machine and run it from there with no access, and they had like a $2,000 video card on it, but the VM got nothing from it. And it really looked like someone had poured sand into my gas tank. Yeah, it was kind of irritating. We worked around that. So I guess the main thing that I want to show here is, most of what you're seeing here is getting controlled by that ID. However, that doesn't work for everything. Maybe you have views within views, like in this particular instance right here. I'm adding a class to this other container so these items can move in and out. It doesn't make sense to, because still technically I'm in this ordering view. Kind of have this other area that can control those subviews, but in that same way. Fun stuff, and then purchase something, all these other little slight transitions, and so that's the basic gist of that. Any more questions on that?
One other, so every time you use the transition attribute in your CSS, you're creating a new layer in the DOM, a composited layer, I guess, from the GPU, right? Right. One thing I've noticed is compositing too many layers or having transition on everything in the DOM, or too much, or you really got to be careful about what's transitioned, right? You don't want to go crazy with the attribute, right? If this were something that that was going to have a lot of different views. It's actually a very small application. There's probably like 5 total views in this thing at all. And most of this stuff is getting added and removed to it, removed from it. And the sessions, the user session on this is going to be a few minutes tops. You're going in, you're ordering a drink, and you're getting out of it. That being said, there's another component to this that is a much larger screen, and it runs for hours. And there's a lot of animations that happen on that. So I had to pull back on a number of ideas for that particular one because of performance reasons. Right. Here's a quick little thing. Mobile devices as well would have the same. This isn't for mobile. Yeah, I'm saying they suffer from the same
Although,
thing.
I can actually run this on my Galaxy S3.
Does it run
It
fast?
runs pretty good, yeah.
Is that with a Chrome browser? Or?
Yes. Yeah. I haven't actually, not to mention, I haven't looked at how that would run on the native browser, but I don't use a native browser, so. And it's not meant for a mobile device anyway. But no, these transitions, and we're talking about the mobile world, and that's a good point. And you could run into problems with some older browsers. And there are some browsers, some versions of browsers where transitions will work great as long as it's one property. If you're animating two different properties, things start to break. I mean, there's lots of weird idiosyncrasies that come into that, which is why you look at something like jQuery Mobile and you kind of get amazed at all the things, the fallbacks that they built into that. It's amazing, as glitchy as it can be, the things that they pulled off with that is just mind-blowing. Yeah, so I hope some of this stuff has, with the exception of some of this application stuff, I hope some of this has kind of mystified, CSS animation, demystified it to a point where you're going to feel comfortable maybe bringing it into an application. Throw it on some navigation. You know what? If IE9 users can't see the transition, so what? They won't even know what they're not seeing. But the Mozilla, the modern browser users, the people on IE10, they're going to see this little bits of subtle polish that we can start putting in these things. So again, my name, if you want to contact me, my email address is up there. If you want to look at these slides, this is all in HTML, so built on deck.js. The CSS is in there. It's compiled from less, so ping me if you want to look at the less partial. So I got partialed out into a number of different style sheets for organization purposes. So.
Can you post a link to the meetup page too? So everybody can have access?
Absolutely.
The meetup comments? Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll put that on there. And I'll go ahead and post a link to a zip file because, with less, you want to be looking at the unrendered code.